Stay free. See it first on Rumble.
I love having the opportunity to talk to you because I guess we get to investigate ideas that can be defining. When you were talking about this idea of a lost civilization or a golden age, it's significant and interesting to see how frequently that appears in scripture and mythology. Of course, a Jungian or Campbellian, shall we say, analysis of that would be that it is harking back to a kind of prenatal state where, suspended in fluid, we all lived in perpetual bliss, our every need met, not aware of separation, till we were cast out of the garden, forced to fend for ourselves. I only left the breast at 25 myself. And I've still been trying to find a way back, let me tell you. Do you think, then, that the sort of seeming collective memory of Atlantis, or a kind of a golden age, or an imprimatur of a utopia that precedes rather than a utopia to which we aspire, is psychological in its origin or sociological? I know that you're saying it's sociological because of the events you've just described, but do you think that because it seems that one of the most contentious things you say, or one of the things for which you are most attacked, appears to be, like when you talk about Plato talking about Atlantis, and also I know other thing, because I did some research, and I try not to, Graham, because I do like to shoot from the hip.
A good place to shoot from.
Yeah, nice. Yeah. Why bother holding a gun up high? It makes you look stupid. Shoot from down there. It's cooler. I like, one of the things I saw is that when you talk about them kind of sonar radar type scans, you'll tell us the right word in a second, that are possible to do with like the Amazon, and you say, oh, it could be that there's stuff down there. One of the Leary attacks from the mainstream that I saw was the one where I thought, oh my God, I know Graham Hancock. As far as I know, he's not a Nazi. Like, do you know what I mean? Like, it was like, this is so dangerous. And I thought, what is it that Graham Hancock said? He said, it's perfectly okay to leave your dog in the car in summer with all the windows up. Give children sweets and drugs. I'm like, what is it? What has Graham Hancock said? Well, one of the things seemed to be like, like that you've said, using these sonar detection things, it looks like there could be structures in the Amazon.
There definitely are.
Right. Well, one of the things I read was them going, that could be a whole host of things. I'd like to know about the stuff about Plato, and I'd like to know about the stuff of what them sonar things are detecting in the Amazon, please.
All right. Well, first of all, the story of Atlantis, if you mention the word Atlantis to any archaeologist, they will tend to roll their eyes on the assumption that they're dealing with somebody from the lunatic fringe. So almost by definition, if you take the concept of Atlantis seriously, you're regarded by archaeologists and their friends in the media as a kind of lunatic. And I've always found this odd because the earliest surviving source for the tradition of Atlantis is the highly respected figure of Plato. And he passes it down to us in dialogues called the Timaeus and the Critias. And he speaks of an advanced civilization, which was headquartered on an island, and that island was submerged by an enormous flood, and in a single day and night was completely destroyed. Now, the view of archaeology is that this is all a fantastic tale that Plato made up, that he simply wanted to make some kind of political or philosophical point. So he invented Atlantis. Immediately contradicting that is the fact that there are hundreds of traditions from all around the world. Plato is the one that calls it Atlantis, but there are hundreds of traditions from all around the world that speak of a great flood and the destruction of a former civilization. And then the second issue is that Plato includes precise scientific information in the story. And this is what archaeology is ignoring when it says that it's all a fantastical made-up tale. And it's to do with that meltwater pulse 1b that I mentioned, that brought the Younger Dryas to an end 11,600 years ago and raised sea levels massively. Plato said that the story came to him through his family line. His family line included the Greek lawmaker Solon, some 200 or 300 years before. Plato was writing in the 300, Solon's around 600 BC. And Solon made a famous and historically recorded visit to Egypt. There's no dispute about that. And that visit to Egypt was around 600 BC. So that tells us that that visit to Egypt was around 2,600 years before our time today. So there's Solon in Egypt in 600 BC. He's visiting a temple that no longer exists, Temple of Neith at Sais in the Delta. And he's shown writings on the walls by the priests. And he says, what do these writings say? And the priests then unravel the whole story of Atlantis, and they tell how there was this great advanced civilization, which at one time was extremely beneficial and positive to the world, but which fell out of harmony with the universe, became domineering, began to impose its power on other peoples around the world, became arrogant, became overconfident in itself, suffered from hubris, and a ringing phrase ceased to wear its moderation with prosperity. And the universe intervened and struck Atlantis down. So Solon said to the priests, okay, when did this happen? And they said, quite matter-of-factly, 9,000 years ago. That's in 600 BC. Do the math. That's a date in our calendar. That's 9,600 BC. That's 11,600 years ago. That's Meltwater Pulse 1b. The moment I realized that those two things connected, I could no longer accept the derision that is poured on Plato's story. He is giving us a date when we know that there was a huge rise in sea level. And I don't understand why archaeologists are so determined to defend this derision that they pour upon the idea of Atlantis. And often they say, Plato claimed that the story was sourced in ancient Egypt, but there's no such story in ancient Egypt. Again, that's complete rubbish. Visit the Temple of Horus at Edfu in Upper Egypt, which is still standing, and you will find the Edfu building texts, which relate the entire Atlantis story. They don't call it Atlantis. They call it the homeland of the primeval ones, but it's an island. It's struck down and drowned in a flood. There are survivors, and some of those survivors come to Egypt and create primeval mounds, which are to be the site of all future temples and pyramids in Egypt. So the connection to ancient Egypt that Solon draws and Plato passes on is actually very real. It's very solid. And I'm pleased to say that there has now been a full translation of the Edfu text, which has been, it's a translation into German, and the German Archaeological Institute, an individual called Dieter Kurth. It's an incredibly important translation, and it is going to completely unravel the archaeological position on the Egyptian origins of the story of Atlantis. Completely unravel it. And this is going to be very disturbing for archaeology.
I am beginning to understand why there's opposition to challenging convention, because it feels like elsewhere in our culture there is a strong appetite to impose centralized control on many established institutions. I have read and often reflected on the writing of this CIA analyst, Martin Gurry. He says that since we've had the technology to communicate en masse and immediately create counter-narratives, the establishment has had the option of either accepting there are now numerous publics accumulating and aggregating around different issues, and to democratize information and democratize power as much as possible, and recognize that the era of centralization is sort of coming to a type of a conclusion, or to double down on authoritarianism, smear dissent in all of its forms, try to control the narrative by creating opportunity for regulation. And what you're saying, I suppose, because when we use like rhetorically phrases like follow the science, it's a kind of claim for superiority.
Absolutely.
That doesn't acknowledge that science is a subset of all sorts of other interests, most obviously, evidently, observably and measurably financial interests. Plainly, only clinical trials are being undertaken that at some point may become profitable. Perhaps there are less easy to observe biases. Indeed, that's much of your argument that take place in every field, and notably in this case archaeology, because if we start to present a different human history, a different possibility for human future starts to naturally emerge. In my own contemplation of how we might live, I think how did we evolve to live? What is natural for us? Not culturally in a modern sense, but how do we engage with our environment? How do we engage with one another? How do we engage with nature? How do we engage with God? or the unknowable. If there are different cultural examples of that that may be obfuscated by the events you describe, but nevertheless point to the fact that they may not be like savages grunting around and dragging things off into caves, whether to eat them or fornicate with them, but a highly advanced species that could move mountains with their minds, that communicate with unknowable beings from other dimensions, that unlock mathematical mysteries, that appear in hieroglyphs etched upon ancient walls, then the supremacy of the modern era and the institutes that represent it suddenly seem a little more fallible.
That's what I saw most strongly of all in the reaction to Ancient Apocalypse, which is that reaction says that there are forces at work in our society that do not want people thinking for themselves, that do not want people doing their own research and investigating subjects directly, that want people simply to accept what the so-called experts tell them, to buy that in the whole cloth and not argue with it and dispute it in any way. And I think that is a sinister trend in our society. Yes, there's a role for experts. I've said that already. Play an important role. But there's also a role for the individual researcher and for people who get their sleeves rolled up and get down into detail investigating the past for themselves. And while it may be true that a pilot of an airplane does really need to be trained in order to fly that airplane. I wouldn't like to get into an airplane if the pilot wasn't trained to fly an airplane.
Why not? Where's your sense of fun?
It's a different matter with archaeology and with the past. The past is the heritage of all humanity. We all have a right to a point of view on it. We all have a right to look into it. And I think it was that attempt to democratize the past on my part, which led to this ferocious and furious reaction. But I'm really glad there was that reaction because it's created a conversation that otherwise would not have occurred. And it's required archaeologists to look in on themselves and see how they are viewed by the public.